Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone who is here and who is in line to the second public hearing of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. This is the second of 4 public hearings we plan to hear this year to consider comments concerning proposed rent adjustments for renewal leases for apartments, lofts, hotels, and other housing units subject to the rent stabilization laws of 1969 and the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974. These adjustments will affect renewal leases commencing between October 1st, 2014 through September 30th, 2015. My name is Rachel Gotzel. I'm the new chair of the Rent Guidelines Board, and again, welcome and thank you all for participating. We expect it to be a long and very useful and interesting day, and we're looking forward to hearing everyone's comments. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Magda Cruz.
Present.
Harvey Epstein.
Here.
Stephen Flax.
Present.
Shayla Garcia.
Present.
Cecilia Hosa.
Present.
Carol Shine. David Wenk.
Here.
Sarah Williams Willard. Rachel Gotzel. I'm obviously here.
Here.
The next meeting of this board will be a public hearing on June 18th. In all, there will be 2 more public hearings to comment on the proposed guidelines. The following 2 meetings will be in the proposed dates, times, and locations. The next meeting is on Wednesday, June 18th, as I mentioned, at Brooklyn Borough Hall, 209 Joralemon Street. That will be an evening meeting commencing at 5 and ending at approximately 8 or until everyone is heard. And the final public hearing will be Thursday, June 19th at Queensborough Hall, 120/55 Queens Boulevard, again beginning at 5 and going until 8 or until everyone is heard. Directions to these hearings can be found on our website, nycrgb.org, in the About Us section, meeting schedule. You can sign up to pre-register to speak by calling the Rent Guidelines Board offices at 212-385-2934. And of course, as always, there are copies of our meeting schedules here today. The final vote will take place on June 23rd, a week from today, beginning at 6 p.m. That meeting will be held in the Great Hall at Cooper Union, 7 East 7th Street at the corner of 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. To board members, please note that drafts of both a hotel and apartment explanatory statements are in your folders. We request your comments and or suggested additions to the statements no later than the morning of June 23rd. Revised drafts will be sent to you via email by Friday, June 20th, reflecting additions resulting from the public hearings. Any questions, please see Andrew. Also find written submissions that the RGB staff has received since June 12th. So any of you who do send in written submissions to the RGB, they are distributed to board members. So I'd just like to briefly summarize the proposed guidelines adopted at the preliminary vote on May 5th, 2014. So this summary reflects the guidelines that are, and this is for informal use. You are all here obviously commenting on the initial preliminary vote. That vote obviously isn't binding. The purpose of these hearings is to hear from you and to determine what the final vote will be. Copies of the proposed orders are now available from our offices at 51 Chambers Street or from our website, nycrgb.org. So I'm not going to read these in full. I'll just summarize them, but if you would like to see more detail, please do feel free to look on our website, and they're available there. So I think the most pertinent are likely the proposed rent-stabilized apartment renewal guidelines, and they are as follows. For a 1-year renewal lease, commencing on or after October 1st, 2014 and on or before September 30th, 2015, the proposed range is between 0 and 3%. For a 2-year renewal lease commencing on or after October 1st, 2014 and on or before September 30th, 2015, the proposed range is between 0.5 and 4.5%. There's a proposed sublet allowance in the event of a sublease governed by the relevant subdivision. The allowance authorized by such subdivision shall be, the proposed range is between 0 and 10%. So these are, I think, the most pertinent proposals from our initial vote, and these I expect will receive the most attention from your comments. Again, if you're interested in reviewing the entire summary, please feel free to look on our board, on our website. So we will now begin. Our testimony will begin with Anita Ram.
Rachel? Are we going to be interpreting during this meeting? Interpretation? Is interpretation going to happen during this meeting? Interpretation.
The person who we know.
Good afternoon. My name is Anita Rahm. I'm the songwriter for Metropolitan Council on Housing, and I have been speaking here for the past 20 years. Every time the Rent Guidelines Board has voted a rent increase higher than what the landlords really deserve, based on what I have read in the reports your staff has worked on. I have been coming to our little meetings and reading the reports. According to the income and expense study, the net operating income went up above the level of the expenses. You have it in your power to make up for the sins of the past, Rent Guidelines Board, by giving us a rent rollback. At this time, any increase is uncalled for and could accelerate the rate of homelessness, business failures, when people can't afford to buy anything, diseases, when people can't afford necessary medications, broken families, and children ending up in orphanages to subsist on diets of gruel. Please help save an endangered species, rent-stabilized tenants. Please consider voting a rent rollback. Laissez-faire mon derrière. Give us a rent rollback, will ya, huh? Give us a rent rollback, will ya, huh? Previous rent boards have raised all of our rents above the level dictated by common sense. Give us a rent rollback, will ya, huh? And you won't have to listen to my song. Very good.
Our second speaker will be James Anderson. Oh, I'm sorry. Our second speaker will be Councilman Corey Johnson.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Corey Johnson, and I represent the 3rd Councilmanic District in the New York City Council, which covers the neighborhoods of Hell's Kitchen, Chelsea, the West Village, parts of Soho, and parts of the Upper West Side. This mixed income district is composed of thousands of rent-stabilized tenants, many of whom already allocate too high a percentage of their incomes to pay their rent. Over the past decade, the Rent Guidelines Board has overcompensated landlords to the detriment of tenants. This massive increase in ownership income occurred as tenants' incomes declined, housing affordability deepened, and homelessness in our city skyrocketed. The Rent Guidelines Board today must freeze rents for rent-stabilized tenants and set this city upon corrective course. The rent stabilization law requires that the RGB to consider cost of living increases for tenants, not merely owner cost increases, a mandate that has been disregarded for far too long. If the board based its decisions on these standards, and I strongly urge it to do so, it will impose a freeze on rents for all rent-regulated apartments, as well as lofts, hotels, rooming houses, single-room occupancy buildings, and lodging houses. This unwarranted increase in landlord-owner income, which was nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to move towards deregulation, was not supported by reliable cost data. The Rent Guidelines Board own reports demonstrate that owner net operating incomes are 31.5% higher than they were in 1990. By contrast, the average amount of rent paid by stabilized tenants has increased almost 35% of household incomes, the highest rent burdens ever recorded. From 2007 to 2012, the average rent went up 14% after inflation, as income dropped by 4%. That rising rents have outpaced incomes is among the surest indicators that the city's prosperity is not equitably shared by its poor, working, and middle-class families. Over a third of all rent-stabilized households pay more than 50% of their income towards rent. In comparison, according to the Department of Finance, owners' net operating income has increased 9.6% in just 1 year last year. This year, there is an opportunity for the RGB to correct course and provide tenants with essential relief by rejecting rent increases that serve only to enhance landlord profits and further destabilize New York City's affordable housing stock. The goal of this board in setting things back on track should be to restore the operating cost to rent ratio to 64.3%, the ratio that existed in 2008. Given RGB staff projections that prices are expected to rise 1.7% in the coming year, a complete rent freeze would cause the O&M ratio to rise to 62.5%. I have one more sentence. Over the next year, and wouldn't account for the aging of the stock, the lingering effects of the recession. The RGB must act without hesitation to fulfill its mandate and the findings of its own data and provide relief where it has inflicted undue harm for so long by freezing rents for 1- and 2-year leases. Let's do the right thing for New Yorkers. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you for your testimony.
Rachel, I have a quick question for the council member, if I could.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Councilman Johnson, for your helpful testimony. I wanted to point out, recently we've heard from the real estate industry that if there was a rent freeze, it would be catastrophic. They've used the word catastrophic for New York City. I'm wondering how you respond to those claims based on your testimony today.
Well, I would say that we have seen development in the city increase since the recession. We have seen prices continue to go up, and we have seen landlords and owners do quite well, as the numbers have indicated. What I think would be catastrophic is to further hurt tenants in any way by increasing rents. Let me just point out, 48% of New Yorkers, over 4 million people in our city, are living at or below the poverty line. We had an election. We have a new mayor, a new public advocate, a new comptroller, a new speaker of the council, 4 new borough presidents, and 21 freshman members. There is a clear mandate for the RGB to finally do the right thing. Let's stop balancing rents on the backs of tenants in New York City and do the right thing for the most number of New Yorkers. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So our next 3 speakers will be James Anderson, William Stanford, and Jack Freund. Mr. Anderson. James Anderson. Mr. Freund?
Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Jack Freund, and I'm here representing the interests and concerns of the 25,000 members of the Rent Stabilization Association, mostly small property owners who own or manage the majority of the city's 1 million rent-regulated apartments. We have submitted our comments on the preliminary guidelines for your review. I urge the public members to reconsider the direction in which these guideline deliberations are heading and to consider final rent guidelines substantially higher than the proposed preliminary range. Building operating costs continue to escalate by an average of more than 6% per year, primarily as a result of increased real estate taxes and water and sewer charges. Rent increases enacted by the RGB in recent years have covered only half of those increasing costs. Yet rental property owners face the prospect of unprecedented low guidelines this year, perhaps even a rent freeze. You should not allow yourselves to believe that zero guidelines or inadequate guidelines will be a rent holiday only for this year. Once you go down this path, you will have changed the playing field. You will have committed the RGB to a series of inadequate guidelines, creating a potential disaster for the rental housing stock, for its tenants, and for the city's economy as a whole. Final rent guidelines within the preliminary range will result in deteriorating living conditions for tenants, financial instability for rent-stabilized properties, and the loss of affordable apartments. The role of the RGB is not to balance the interests of tenants and owners. This was not the intention of the rent stabilization law, nor is it a feasible goal. The role of the RGB is to set reasonable rent increases that allow owners to maintain their properties while also protecting tenants from the unlimited rent increases available in the unregulated
let each
market.
person testify, and let's hear each person's voice.
The angle's better.
Nor is there any rational basis for shifting even more of the increase in building operating costs to owners. The majority of stabilized tenants benefit from rent-to-income ratios that are much lower than the city or national averages. Our report demonstrates that most stabilized tenants have rent-to-income ratios of 21%, not 32%. These households can well afford a reasonable rent increase. We also find that at least 30% of rent-stabilized buildings are operating at a loss or are economically marginal. Workforce housing provided by these buildings may be lost without reasonable rent increases. We do recognize that housing affordability is a concern, but point out that rising rent burdens is a nationwide trend resulting from broad structural changes. RGB actions alone cannot mitigate housing affordability problems, certainly not without threatening the living conditions of tenants and jeopardizing future investments in the city's rental stock. Affordability, I'll wrap up, affordability concerns can be properly addressed by many of the social welfare initiatives announced or already undertaken by the current city administration without placing a public burden solely on the backs of rental property owners. These initiatives include raising the SCREE eligibility limit to $50,000, reinstating some version of the Advantage Rent Subsidy Program, and providing free legal assistance in housing court for poor tenants threatened with eviction. These are all initiatives the RSA has supported in the past and which provide for more effective remedies than a rent increase. We ask you to reconsider. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony.
Mr. Freund, I have some questions.
Questions?
Thank you for your testimony this afternoon, Mr. Freund. I have two questions. Is it your understanding, based on your experience, that the operating margins of smaller buildings, defined as buildings 20 units or less, are different from the operating margins of larger buildings? And if that is the case, what percentage, roughly, of the rent-stabilized housing stock is comprised of the smaller buildings?
Well, we know that the very small buildings, those with less than 10 units, well, let me start by saying that all small buildings, by which I mean less 20 units or fewer, are characterized by lower rents, higher operating costs, and therefore narrow operating margins. We know that the buildings of 10 units or less, of which they're about two-thirds of the buildings, about 28,000 buildings, and one-third of the rental, one-third of the stabilized housing stock, which are in those buildings, are not even up for consideration here because they don't file RPIE statements, and there's been no effort made. Some do file, but there's been no effort made to factor that in to the net operating income numbers you're looking at. This puts these owners at a severe disadvantage, and it doesn't give you a full picture. And one of our suggestions for future research on the part of the RGB staff is to try to integrate those small buildings. As I said, we know that they have lower rents, higher costs, higher operating margins, and that needs to be considered. Did I answer?
One more question. Addressing the issue of affordability for the more vulnerable tenants of our city, senior citizens, could you talk about the SCREE and the DRE program and how that is viewed by the membership of the Rent Stabilization Association?
Well, we welcome subsidy programs for tenants, including Section 8, including SCREE, including DRE, and we would welcome, as I indicated, any revival of the Advantage program by this administration or any other subsidy programs. There have been a number of them under discussion, and we think that's the way you take care of the affordability issue. To the extent, and we readily acknowledge that as the prior speaker indicated, I believe it's about 20%, 21% of the city's population that's below the poverty line, but that's a lot of people, and they deserve to get the rental assistance that they need. To put that burden on property owners simply by saying, okay, we know that costs have increased by nearly 6% this year, but we're not even going to give you half of that cost increase because some people some tenants can't afford that rent increase. That's wrong. That's a very destructive tactic. You have to reverse course, urge the administration to get those rent subsidy programs in place sooner rather than later, and then give owners what they need to be able to pay their real estate taxes, pay their water and sewer charges, pay all their other operating costs, and make a business. Let's remember, this is a business. It's not a philanthropy. Owners are not in that business.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you for your testimony. I just have a couple of quick questions if I can. First, I really appreciate your comment about landlords needing rent subsidies, and I know as tenants would love to expand opportunities for jury and scree and Section 8. Are you representing today that the RSA would go to Albany and Washington with tenants and support increasing the caps for jury and work with us to increase Section 8 subsidies available for tenants? Because that would be pretty awesome.
Yes, it would, and it's so awesome that we've actually done it in the past. As you know, we've worked hand in hand with the Coalition for the Homeless and other groups to try to get the subsidies in there that are needed. In fact, we've gone a step beyond even the advocates by suggesting that scree be opened up to all income-eligible tenants, not just to senior citizens. So we recognize what the needs are, and we'd be perfectly willing, as we have in the past, to work with any willing partners to achieve something concrete.
That was great. The other thing I wanted to ask is just your representation in the information you handed out to us today, that you thought that the issue of balancing the interests of owners and tenants is not the intention of the rent stabilization law. And it seems to me, based on the statute, which I've read many times and have in front of me, that the obligations here are really to look at the data of vacancy, look at the data of the affected area to determine about the needs of the tenants versus the needs of the owner. Are you representing to us now that you think the economic situation of the tenants has no place in our determinations of rents?
Well, unfortunately, yes. I think that is outside of your purview. Your purview as the Rent Guidelines Board and as the, I think, 225 words in the enabling paragraph state is to consider the economic condition of the housing industry. Your mandate, your legislative mandate does not contain the word tenant in it once, does not contain the word affordability, does not talk about balancing any interests. All it talks about is looking at the factors that affect the real estate industry vis-a-vis real estate taxes, other municipal charges, costs, and so on, and to provide appropriate rent increases. That's a very limited role that you have. What is the protection for tenants? I mean, obviously, as in previous testimony I demonstrated to you, I think there's a whole stack of protections that tenants have, including the right to tenure, continued occupancy, succession rights, habitability rights, and so on and so on. The protection that this board affords to tenants is that there is a limit. Doesn't matter if it's 5%, 10%, and there have been years, especially in the early years, when there were double-digit increases granted by the Rent Guidelines Board, because that was what was called for. And tenants are protected by having rent increases that are only what is called for and not the unlimited increases that are available in the free market. This year, what we're suggesting to you, with a continuation of cost increases around the 6% mark, something more than what is on the table right now, something way beyond your preliminary guidelines, is what would be appropriate for this year.
So it sounds like we agree to disagree on this fact, but last question I have for you is that you represented that when the guidelines are higher, conditions when the guidelines are lower, tenants will face worse conditions in their building. The vice versa of that is when the guidelines are higher, like last year, then the conditions in buildings should improve. But we heard at our hearing in the Bronx where over 350 tenants testified, and I think, or appeared, and over 100 tenants testified, and I think one landlord showed up in the entire Bronx hearing, was the opposite. Even though they had high guidelines increases, tenants still suffer from serious repair problems, serious conditions. So I'm wondering how you say then that since we've had a history of high increases, how would you say that a lower increase will just result in that when it doesn't seem like the vice versa has occurred?
I'm glad you asked the question. I mean, the fact of the matter is that according to the Housing and Vacancy Survey, housing conditions in general across the 5 boroughs have never been better than they are now. There are always going to be exceptions, but let's make a point to this. It depends on what your base is. If you've got a building that's got very low rent levels, you can have very high rent increases and still not generate the amount of income that building needs to perhaps make up for neglected maintenance or whatever this particular situation is. So yeah, you're gonna have still some buildings, but let me give you an example of how good things are, and that is, as you know, under HPD's alternative enforcement program, they pick 200 buildings each year, the worst buildings in the city, in order to target their enforcement efforts at each year. That program's been operating for a few years now. They're having trouble finding 200 buildings that meet the criteria of that program. So I understand tenants who come up, you know, there are neglected buildings in the city, but it's certainly the case that that guideline increases on a regular basis have turned New York City's stabilized housing stock into a state where conditions have never been better. And it's certainly the case that if those necessary increases to meet operating costs don't continue, you're going to have a deterioration. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but it will have an effect.
Thank you, Mr. Freund.
I have a quick question.
Okay. We have one final question from the board, and then we have one final question from the board, and then we'll have an opportunity to hear from further testimony.
Hi. I just have a quick question. So I'm new to the board, obviously, and I think that's really what you're saying is, you know, basically, like, or at least what your commercials and the blitz that's happening, the media blitz, is saying that, you know, heat and hot water will not be provided when it's mandated by law, that, you know, it's going to be cut, you know, things are going to happen. And I would love if you could expand on what kind of catastrophic things will happen if we don't have a rent freeze, when we've had continuous increases year after year, even though maybe, you know, we don't know what your books look like. And I just sort of a follow-up, it would be really great if you're representing 25,000 owners to have them, you know, willingly open their books so we can have a better look at what's going on and make a better determination.
You know, let me just comment on this continued, I understand you're new to the Rent Guidelines Board, but let me explain to you then that owners do open their books. They open their books each year to the Department of Finance by filing their income and expense statements. That is what I call opening the books. They do so under threat of perjury. And so the books are open. They are not open for the small buildings, as I've said. And I think already explained adequately that you need money to pay your taxes to run your buildings. Owners will continue to pay their real estate taxes and their water and sewer charges, but without adequate income, somewhere they're going to start cutting corners. And I don't think any of us want to be responsible for that result.
Thank you, Mr. Freund. Mr. Stanford? Mr. Stanford?
As I said before, Rachel, the name is Mr. X. I don't appreciate what you did last Thursday. You picked the wrong place to hold that public hearing, and what happened? Numerous private citizens like myself were shut out. Sheila and Harvey told you what happened, and you ignored them. I testified, was the first one who testified, and you ignored me. It's obvious you don't wish to be here. It's obvious you're just an operative. You're just a Marvin Markup and Johnny Kimball operative. It's obvious you're a rude operator, not a smooth operator like Sade. It's obvious you don't wish to give it the sweetest taboo like Sade. It's obvious you have no common sense, and I can prove it. I can prove it. You have one public hearing that was scheduled to start at 2 p.m. You had another 3 more that started at 5 p.m. I told you last Thursday. Starting a public hearing at 5 p.m. is bad, but starting at 2 p.m. is even worse. People are still working, but you want them to testify. How are they supposed to testify and they're still working? You tell them they should choose between testifying at a public hearing and working. That's not very swift. And also, there are other things that aren't very swift. 2 of these public hearings are scheduled to be held in buildings at magnetometers, which is unfair to us because that's shuts us out. Okay? You never stated where exactly the June 19th public hearing would be. You said it would be held at Queensboro Hall, but where exactly will it be held? It's unlisted on the paper, it's unlisted on the website.
I just want to say, I have to say that while I appreciate your testimony, I do have to say that the chair has been extremely open to keeping the hearing open as long as possible so everyone can be able to testify. And even though we're starting this at 2, she has represented to me, and I believe her, and that she's going to keep this open again. So while some people need to be here during the day, there are seniors who can't come at night, we need to be flexible. That's why this is the only hearing starting the day. The other 3 hearings are at night. And I would really applaud her effort so far this year to make this an open and inclusive process. So I really value what you're saying, but I have a really different perspective.
Harvey, forget it. Okay? Forget it. Okay, she didn't share my concerns. She didn't share our concerns last Thursday. It's time for her to go. She can't share our concerns. She can't share your concerns. Why is she here?
Excuse me. I think that civility and respect is a two-way street, and people here have the right to say what they wish to say, but not to insult the chair of our board or any of the board members. So please,
Maggie,
if you could please conclude your remarks, and so that we can move on to substantive matters of this board.
Maggie, I don't know what you're implying. What did you do for this board in the last 8 years? And you say I insulted her? I didn't insult her. She insulted us. Oh, well, you come up with this attitude about me. You see me in the last 8 years. What are you talking about? What are you
thank you for your
implying?
testimony.
You think you're slick. I'm not done with you yet, Rachel.
Helen Rosenthal, can we hear from Helen Rosenthal, please? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Chairperson Godsell and other members of the board, welcome Harvey. It's so nice to see you there. My name is Helen Rosenthal. I'm currently City Councilwoman for the Upper West Side, District 6. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to submit testimony for this hearing, and really thank you for your public service in taking this time and by being a member of the board. I appreciate everyone's time. My testimony is calling for a rent freeze for all tenants. As a community activist, community board chair, and now as an elected official representing tens of thousands of rent-regulated tenants on the Upper West Side, it's clear to me that the historic annual rent increases have created a rent burden crisis that has spiraled out of control for the tenants on the Upper West Side, and I would argue citywide. My district is definitely encouraged that you've settled on a range of 0 to 3% for the 1-year lease and 0.5 to 4.5 for the 2-year lease for the rent-stabilized tenants, and a 0% increase for the SRO tenants in its preliminary vote on Monday. While this is refreshing and a good step in the right direction, I ask your final vote be a 0 rent increase for all tenants, SRO and rent stabilized. This board must take the necessary measures to address the disappearance of our affordable housing stock and take a firm stance to help tenants stay in their homes. An increase will only further undermine the availability of affordable housing in this city and in my district in particular. There's ample evidence that the current cost of living has outstripped the tenants' ability to pay. The RGB increases are not the only way in which the rent-stabilized rents go up, as you know. Tenants also experience rent increases via the MCIs, the vacancy bonuses, and individual apartment improvement increases. In addition to the financial stresses of meeting their rental obligation, unscrupulous landlords, and we know there are many of them out there, employ various tactics to harass and wear down the tenants' resources, making it harder for them to keep their homes. And as a new member of the council in my office for only 6 months, my office has already tried to help hundreds of tenants who are being harassed out of our apartments. And if I could stress that I'm not exaggerating here, we actually keep the statistics in the council's database called CouncilStat. We enter the names of every tenant who comes into our office and their exact harassment complaint. We had over 700 names registered. I've been in office for 6 months. This reality is backed by larger convincing numbers as well. According to your board's analysis, since 1994, roughly 153,000 units were added to the rent-stabilized system, while at least 256,000 rent-stabilized units were deregulated, a net loss of 103,000. And keep in mind, at least 10% of those citywide units were in my district alone. We've lost in the last 7 years nearly 15,000 rent-regulated units. And this is data from the Furman Center, from the Furman Center, from your board, and from AMNHD. Thank you. That's exactly who I meant. So between your rent increases, the additional fees, the provisional add-ons, and tenant harassments, tenants and affordable housing on my Upper West Side, in addition to citywide, just don't stand a chance. This board can this year choose no increase and push back against the growing tide of families and individuals being shut out from reasonably priced housing. The job of government and of public servants is to ease the burden of those who need government services the most. Please look at the larger economic picture and see that the city is losing affordable housing at a time when residents need it most. At this juncture, any rent increase further widens the chasm between rich and poor. Instead, we need to look for every opportunity to stabilize the middle class and empower working people. When the mayor talks about a divided city between rich and poor and two cities, there's only one thing that's holding us together in terms of affordable housing at this juncture, and it's our rent-stabilized tenants, in addition to Mitchell-Lama, and all of that lies in your hands. I ask you to please impose a freeze on all rents, both for the apartments and the SRO units, with no provisional add-ons. The financial burden on the tenants is already overwhelming. Thank you.
All right. Any questions? Any questions from the board? Please.
Hi, Sheila.
Hi, how are you? I just have a quick question about what do you think? So we all know that based on all of the evidence that you highlighted and that the board has highlighted in the past, that tenants are struggling. What do you think it would mean to tenants in your district for an increase of 6% like it has been suggested? How would they struggle? What will change in their lives?
I mean, it's the difference between being able to stay in their home and not stay in their home, first off. Any increase increases the burden on them. My tenants on the Upper West Side are choosing between paying utilities and paying for food. After-school programs for their children have already gone out the door. They don't have money for that. What they have money for now is food, shelter, and the basic necessities. Any increase is a burden.
Further questions?
Yes, I have a question about your testimony concerning the large number of harassment complaints that your office appears to be recording. We received testimony by the Division of Housing and Community Renewal, and they obviously have a harassment bureau. And according to their statistics, the cases are actually diminishing. And so the testimony that you gave is quite surprising to me. When your staff receives this information, do you counsel your constituents
Yes.
to the many, many resources in the city where tenants can obtain relief for real actions of harassment? And there are many, both in administrative law as well as in the housing court, and New York state law provides multiple ways for tenants to receive remedies for acts of harassment.
I appreciate your question. You're giving me a chance to expound on what's going on in my office. My first thought is if 5 to 700 cases is a diminishment from Gail Brewer's tenure of a 6-month period, that's saying something. So I can't do it I don't know what her caseload was. I can only tell you my caseload. And in the first, as I say, in the first 6 months, we've had between 600 and 700 of unique cases. Of the 600 to 700, about 550 are in my district. There are people who come to my office from the Bronx, from Brooklyn. We actually have a chart which I could give you this information that is mapped out exactly where the cases come from. I'd be happy to give that to you as supplement to my testimony. And in terms of being able to send people to resources, we absolutely do. There are some resources out there. We also have a housing clinic in my district that people attend once a month. There are usually about 80 to 100 people who come to that housing clinic, and they get to see a lawyer. If we were to hold that, if we had enough funds, if the city could provide us enough funds and we were to double or quadruple the amount of housing clinics we held, all of those evenings would be filled to capacity, again, with unique people, because each month they come for different topic areas. Right now, I would say about less than 10% of the people coming to our office get represented by a lawyer in housing court. We try to give them as much sort of basic common sense information, but there aren't actually enough lawyers, and trust me, this office, it's the Upper West Side, we're very knowledgeable about all the different resources that are out there. About 10% of the people who we refer actually get a lawyer. The rest of the people, we're just trying to give them some common sense information, but they're really out there defending themselves and mostly losing. Since I've been in office, to my knowledge, we've lost over 100 of the cases that where people have actually lost the case, been evicted, but it was a case where it was clear harassment. You know, these people had been paying on time, had records of paying on time, but had simply, you know, the lawyers, these are old people, these are people who don't have a lot of wherewithal necessarily, and the lawyers on the other side were able to win cases by just beating them down to nothing. And these people end up, you know, we track them actually, and they end up staying in a friend's house for a while, and eventually, I don't know what. Now, there are citywide statistics that show that of the 30,000 people who are being evicted every year, 30% of them, or 10,000 people, end up on our homeless rolls. And, you know, it's an argument that I use internal to the council to try to get to the city to fund more lawyers. If we could represent more than the 10% of the cases that come in to housing court, each lawyer is maybe cost $2,000 to $3,000. Well, the rent for a homeless shelter is about $3,000 a month. So I'm trying to make an argument to the mayor that it would be more cost efficient for us to pay for the homeless, to pay for the lawyer in housing court. That would be cheaper than what ends up happening, which is we end up having them as homeless shelter clients. And keep in mind the other dynamic that's going on in my district. We have on the Upper West Side, and I know this isn't the case throughout the city, we have a number of SROs. And what the landlords do is I've seen this happen now 3 times in the last, I would say, just couple of years as I've been more actively engaged. The landlords basically harass out the SRO tenants and then ask the city's Department of Homeless Services to become a homeless shelter. And then the folks coming into the homeless shelter, some of them end up being the exact client that they have harassed out. So I don't know it's not working on the Upper West Side. It would be more cost efficient for the city to pay the rent to the landlords and keep these people out of the shelters. But that's ridiculous public policy. I mean, that doesn't make sense. But that is the reality of what I'm seeing and what I'm trying to deal with. I've got 2 buildings right now where tenants are being actively harassed.
This is so interesting, but we have so many speakers. No, I really appreciate your testimony. Thank you so much.
Just following up. Any other questions?
Yeah, I just have one quick question. We've heard from the real estate industry a little while ago that they said your proposal of a rent freeze would be extremely problematic in New York City, would destroy the real estate market in these kind of large terms. I'm wondering how you respond to the argument that this will be catastrophic for New York City to have a rent freeze.
It's not clear to me how that's possible when the landlords are, it's so mind-boggling that that would be possible. So what would happen with a rent freeze is we would keep people in their homes. And it just seems like common sense public policy to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Who do I submit this to?
Oh, yeah, actually, if you could bring it to. Thank you so much. If we could hear from Councilwoman Margaret Chin and then Sandy Rosen.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this year's proposed range of rent guideline increase. And I also want to thank the board for holding meetings in the other boroughs so that more residents and landlords can participate, and that's the way it should be. As the council member for District 1 in Lower Manhattan, I represent tens of thousands of rent-regulated tenants. For many of these tenants, rent regulation is the only thing keeping them in their home. As real estate price goes up and the cost of living continue to rise rapidly. Over the past decade, we have seen many of our neighborhoods change significantly. In many cases, this is due to the constant influx of newcomers and the gentrification of community that once offer affordable housing. Within all this, there's one underlying fact. As we lose affordable housing across the city, so many residents are being priced out of the communities that they helped to build. Many of them are seniors who have extremely limited income. These seniors rely on affordable housing in order for them to age in place. Other residents affected by this are working families who cannot afford to live anywhere else but their rent-stabilized units. And to them, it's a blessing if they live in a rent-regulated apartment. These are the very same people who are sustaining the tradition and culture of their neighborhoods, but they are threatened every day with the possibility of losing their homes. Why? Because they can't afford to pay rent. So today, I'm here on their behalf to urge you all to support a rent freeze. We must think about this in the context of Mayor de Blasio's recent proposal to create and preserve 200,000 units of affordable housing in this city. I ask you to think about how we as civic leaders can work together to reach that goal. The key here is that a rent freeze will not just bring much needed relief to our residents, it will also prevent many units from being deregulated due to high rent vacancy deregulation. So if we are serious about protecting our seniors' affordable housing stock, we must not increase rental rates that have already risen faster than inflation and median income. According to a report published this year by the NYU Furman Center, nearly 100,000 units in Manhattan alone were deregulated and converted to market rate housing in the years between 2002 and 2012. So in a decade span, we have lost that much of the city's affordable housing stock. Within this same period, the number of market rate rental units in Manhattan has increased by 20%. Now, the Rent Guideline Board was created to recognize the reality of what both tenants and landlords face, especially in time of economic hardship. The effect of the recession have continued to impact tenants, and the increases approved by this board have so far outstripped increases to tenants' income level. At this point, proposing any rental increase will further endanger our city's affordability and New Yorkers' ability to remain here. And when we threaten the livability of our city, we threaten the economic vitality and the vibrancy of a place that has long been home to artists, entrepreneurs, students, seniors, and working class families. So on behalf of my constituents, I urge you to do the right thing and vote for a rent freeze this year. Thank you.
Any questions from the board?
Hey, Councilmember Chin, how are you? Thank you for coming to testify today. And so you mentioned that the units that are being lost in your district. I'm wondering how rent freeze would play out in your district versus an increase of 6, 7, 8%, which is what we've heard the real estate industry propose. How would it make a difference to your constituents?
I mean, it definitely makes a big difference when people are working in low-wage jobs, when they're not even getting minimum pay or time and a half or vacation pay. Luckily, they're getting sick days, right? Because City Council passed the bill. But every single year, I was just looking from 2000 to 2013. In the last 5 years, every year there's an increase. When the economic time is bad, there's an increase. When the economy is getting better, there's an increase. All right? So tenants needs a break. I mean, the landlord, when they don't provide heat and hot water, they still get a rent increase. When they don't do repair, they still get a rent increase. That is just not fair. So this is the time to say, stop. Let's just freeze the rent right now and really look at how the city as a whole, we can work together to make the city livable for everyone. I mean, for all the hardworking people in my district, they work hard, they work long hours. But when you're talking about the rent increase that the real estate industry is proposing, 6, 7% a year, that is ridiculous, okay? It's totally ridiculous. And you're talking about, and we're not talking about cheap rent. Okay, people right now in my district in Chinatown and the Lower East Side, they're paying more than $1,000 worth, $1,000 a month for rent or more. So you're talking about every month an extra, according to them, $60, $70 a month. That could mean, yeah, paying for after-school program for their kids, or buying food, or buying medicine. So I think this is the time where I urge you to really take a step forward, stand up for the rights of every New Yorker's here. Give us a rent freeze and see what that looks like, okay? Because it never happened in the city. So let's make it happen. It's up to you, so I hope that you will take up that challenge. All right, be brave and institute a rent freeze this year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Any further questions from the board? Thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you.